Welcome back to the Ultimate Guide. This is part two, and we'll be covering vehicles. So, vehicles to begin, I play a lot, as you can see. My vehicle stat is 100. They're incredibly effective if used well, and a lot of people choose not to counter it or do not know how to counter it properly. Now, to counter vehicles, the best ways are either to deploy vehicles of your own, which are then suited to vehicle combat, like the main battle tank, but more on this later, or deploying operators like Uluru and Viren, who have the explosive capabilities to deal with armored vehicles. So, as for the vehicles themselves, you have 9 vehicles in total. You basically have two of each. You have two tanks, you have two eight-wheelers, two four-wheelers, two helicopters, and then just the quad bike. Now, starting off with the main battle tank, this, as the description says, is the king of the battlefield, but only if it's used properly. I cannot tell you how often I've seen tanks be destroyed within seconds after them being driven mindlessly into a capture zone without any thought for tactical placement or sightlines. So that being said, having this tank, I would always suggest that you play close enough to your infantry and are able to support from one or two sides and have a viewpoint of the entire front line, like in trench lines, the left or far right side of the maps. They would be really good in pushing Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie. Now to the modification itself. In this tank, you have 4 stations: the driver's seat, weapon station, weapon pod, and the commander position. Each station has its own function. The driver does that. He drives and has a primary and secondary weapon and also 2 gear slots to operate. So the primary weapon, your choices are the default option, the armor-piercing shell. This is a all-rounder. It works fantastically well and is suitable for every single situation that you come across. It has an ammunition capacity of 5, and its reload time is also reasonable. Then you have the high explosive shell, which only really does damage against infantry, but this being a tank, I wouldn't ever equip this because you will be targeted by other vehicles, and this is a sure way to get yourself killed if other vehicles are in the area. This is the complete opposite, vice versa effect. You've got huge benefits in vehicle to vehicle combat, but you would probably just be surrounded by infantry and be rocketed or be exploded to destruction by operators like Uluru or Viren. Now, for the secondary weapon, I always choose the heavy machine gun rather than the light one. The fire rate is quite noticeable, but it's also more manageable. And if you know how to trace quite well, then you do not need the light machine gun. And also the range difference is significant. If you use the tank for long range engagements against infantry, just outside of the range where they can fight you properly, the heavy machine gun is definitely the way to go. Now, some of the most important things here, the gear slots. The default equipment for all vehicles would be the smoke grenade except the quad bike and the helicopters. I would always choose the thermal smoke grenade because the regular one does not protect you from infrared scanners. If a recon operator or a Luru or different vehicles lock onto you, then the thermal smoke grenade will give you at least one chance to get away or quickly fight back or get into a safe location. And whilst also still covering the lines of sight like the regular smoke grenade. So this has no drawbacks, it's only positive. I would always use the thermal smoke grenade. Now for the second gear slot, you've got the repair kit or active defense. Repair kits are really helpful, especially when you do not have much support with you and there's no vehicle support station nearby. There are vehicle support stations all around the maps, in every map, but they are quite far apart and they have a cooldown. And the cooldown is roughly a minute, so having this repair kit would allow you to stay on the front lines for longer and just make you a more powerful supporting force. And it restores roughly a third or a quarter of your hit points once used. And the cooldown is around 30 seconds, whereas the cooldown for a vehicle repair station, which fully regenerates your health, is around a minute. And then you have the active defense. This is really powerful, but only once you're in vehicle to vehicle combat. The advantage that you would get from this is only defensive, and normally the vehicle that realizes that the other is there first tends to win the fight if they're equipped for that situation. But that being said, if you do equip this, it will reduce very, very significantly any damage that you take, and it is active for quite a long time. But also, when you activate it, people can see that you've activated it. So, a intelligent player, they would simply wait behind cover for this to wear off and then engage you again after you have decided to either push or do something else. So once this runs out, you don't have any advantage. If this was a passive trait, this would be a brilliant gadget or gear slot, but because it isn't, I would always stick with the repair kit for its increased functionality. Now, the passenger seat or the weapon station has the choice between two machine guns or a wire-guided missile. For the same reasons as the coaxial machine gun, I always use the heavy machine gun for my passengers because it does more damage and it has a higher range, and it's also quite a lot more accurate, even more so than the difference between the coaxial light and heavy. Or lastly, you have the wire-guided missile. Now, this is really good against vehicles, and these function irregardless of whether they have thermal camouflage, deploy flares for the helicopters, or a thermal smoke grenade. If you have a team that is struggling to deal with a vehicle on the battlefield and you need them dealt with quickly, this is a sure way of reducing the time of that engagement significantly. But the main cannon is so useful in the first place that I tend to ignore this option, because if you position or use your tank wisely, you'll be able to end engagements very swiftly anyways, and then in that case, it's better to have more defense against infantry. Then you've got the third seat, which is the weapon pod. Now, These are very rarely used, especially the commander seat. But when they are used, they can be really effective. Now, you've got the 40 canister round, which functions, it's nothing like a shotgun, but it functions similarly to a shotgun. You have to reload after every hit, and it fires 9 projectiles at the same time in a square pattern, and as the description says, deals great damage to infantry. Then you have the rocket barrage. The rocket barrage is really powerful against vehicles, but because of its limited explosive damage, is effectively useless against infantry. And I would always aim for my main battle tank to be equipped against infantry. Now, the other options I haven't used a lot, but I am sure that if they're used properly, they can be uh, quite devastating. Now, the multiple grenade launcher is the default equipment on some other vehicles, I believe, but this option isn't very nice. It has a very strange arc, and the damage radius of the explosions isn't very high. It also has a quite high or quite slow reload speed and low magazine capacity. So I would stick with something much faster like the canister round. The same goes for the mortar due to its low reload speed. And then lastly, you have the kinetic grenade. I haven't used this. I have never even seen it used. The ricocheting function itself is sort of useless because you can destroy most cover with your tank in the first place. So it makes no sense to try to shoot around or try to shoot through cover if you can simply destroy it by either driving through it or disrupting it with your main battle cannon. Then the last and most underused seat in the main battle tank, but one of the most powerful, is the commander. Now, the commander has a detector and scanner, and this, similarly to the recon operators, simply marks enemies within the radius of the detector or the scanner, which is a much wider area. And these marks will be visible to the entire tank crew, and it will be really easy to fight accordingly. It's almost like having wall hacks. You basically cannot miss if you have a person who's good at a commander slot. Now, carrying on with the tanks, you also have the light tank. Now, this is much more well suited against infantry. If you encounter a main battle tank or any vehicle that is equipped to do high damage to vehicles, it'll be quite difficult to get away. As it says here, it's got weak protection, it's got fairly low hit points, it will be destroyed much faster than a main battle tank, for instance. And for this one, positioning is far more important. If you position your tank to the side, you will take less damage due to the increased armor plating. I would never suggest to anyone that they should use this tank as a frontline engagement tool, because the enemy vehicles or just counters like Viren and Uluru with their explosives or rocket launchers, they will just instantly destroy you. But that being said, it is highly effective against infantry, which is precisely why I use the multi-purpose shell rather than the gun-launched missile. The multi-purpose shell does enough damage to vehicles and has a quite high radius of explosion to deal damage to infantry, whereas the launch-guided missiles can lock onto ground vehicles. However, this is instantly countered by thermal decoys, and it doesn't work against aerial targets, which is also something to consider, especially in King of the Hill matches. Now, for the other options in the driver's seat, it's more of the same as in the heavy tank, and I have the same equipment as on the main battle tank for the same reasons. However, here you can argue the active defense more, seeing as you've got lower HP, so it makes sense to have, and even for a short time, a boost to your defensive capabilities. But because the hit points are so low in the first place, I still believe that the repair kit is superior. Now, that being said, the weapon station, this is the infantry killing machine. The machine guns have a very high fire rate and they're also really accurate. And the grenade launchers are also really fast. They fire 8 rounds before needing to reload, and whilst that is automatically reloading, you can switch to the machine gun and continue suppressing the enemy infantry and vice versa. If you have a good player in this seat, this vehicle is easily one of the best in the game. Then lastly, you have the commander. Instead of a scanning function, you have a GTQ. The detector function is the same, but this is almost like a missile of sorts, but because the commander seat is always empty, you unfortunately don't see this used a lot, but it is quite, or as it says here, considerably effective, and this is good against both infantry and enemy vehicles, but this is primarily against or useful in situations where you would be aiming at an objective. So if you aim this at a capture site, that's the only time where it would really be applicable, since otherwise the vehicles just tend to move really quickly if the enemy team knows what they're doing. Now, moving on from the tanks, you've got the eight-wheelers. You've got an anti-aircraft vehicle, and you've got a vehicle which can be used to fight armor or infantry. Now, I haven't unlocked everything on this vehicle, as you can see here, but it has quite a lot of similarities to the light tank. Now, the high explosive shell is a really high fire rate weapon and is, as it says here, highly effective against light infantry and light armor. So I prefer to use it since it's an all-rounder, as opposed to this, which is suited against proper vehicle combat. But these vehicles I would not suggest to use against other tanks. If you encounter a light tank, this is a good choice, but for heavy battle tanks, I would stick to trying to counter them with infantry or try to counter it with your own light tanks or a helicopter. Then you also have the canister rounds. Now, I haven't ever seen this used. I cannot imagine it being highly different from the high explosive shell, with the exception of maybe having a lower fire rate and more damage per hit function. But that being said, the secondary weapon is also really important. On this vehicle, I would always suggest to use the wire-guided missile because this works against aerial and ground targets and is unaffected by, here, as it says in the description, infrared decoys, and it can always home in. Whereas the anti-tank missile, it does a lot of damage against ground vehicles, but it can be thrown off by the infrared decoys, and it's also not very useful in the sense that it only fires twice, and after that it takes quite a long time to reload. And in this time, the enemy tanks, they would simply push you and most likely destroy you. And for the gear slots, it's more of the same: thermal, thermal smoke grenade, and repair kit. Now you also have the shrapnel shell. This can be quite useful. It's almost like an area of effect weapon, and it clears things in a certain area. Now, I've rarely seen this used effectively. I would rather have the thermal smoke grenade and try to get away from a situation rather than stay there with my decreased health and try to minimize the losses by causing one or two more casualties for the enemy team. Now, the second one has the weapon station, and here you can really see how little I've played this vehicle. But you have the light and heavy machine gun again, which is more of the same. And then this would be quite interesting. I've only seen this used once. It fires plenty of Molotov-esque grenades, which burn for quite a while and is really helpful in cutting off rotates for the enemy team. And this is the same thing, but rather than firing incendiary grenades, it fires the regular ones. But once these are unlocked, I would choose the 40 millimeter grenade launcher simply because it also helps quite significantly in fighting lightly armored vehicles. And lastly, you have the weapon pod. You again have the 40 millimeter canister round, which is the shotgun-esque weapon. You also have a mortar, which I wouldn't equip due to the reload time, and also on top of that, in most situations, you would not have the time to adjust the trajectory, and overall, it is very not luck based, but immobility based. It leans on the fact that your enemy doesn't move from a certain area, and unlike a guided missile, this wouldn't hit its target if anything moves. And the anti-aircraft cannon, I also wouldn't equip even if I did unlock it, simply because we have an anti-aircraft vehicle which can be equipped to handle those situations really well, which we'll cover now. But all round, the LAV G1, it's all right, but if I was to put this in a tier list, I would put this in B. Now, its counterpart, the anti-air, this is really important in King of the Hill matches. You have way too many vehicles in King of the Hill, and the helicopters very often get ignored, and that's the worst thing you could do. So this is the best counter to aerial vehicles, which are the two helicopters. Now, unlike every machine gun so far, here I've always used the less damaging one. because the aircraft themselves, they move so quickly that you'd rather have the increased fire rate as opposed to the 30 millimeter autocannon. But all round, these are both really good picks, and they both get the job done in their functions if you know how to aim them. Now here you have the anti-aircraft missile. They lock onto enemy aircraft provided that they do not deploy flares. If they do, the missile won't hit its mark, and a helicopter we'll cover later can deploy flares quite frequently. So this is very dependent on how good of a pilot your enemy team is, but it is your secondary weapon. I would more so rely on the autocannon to deal with enemy aircraft. Then you have more of the same for the gear slots, thermal smoke grenade and repair kits. Now for the weapon station, here I also haven't unlocked everything, but I would choose the heavy machine gun just in case there's infantry nearby, or alternatively, this also helps you fight the aerial vehicles as opposed to the ground vehicles, are not bulletproof. If an aircraft is hit by this weapon in combination with the other machine guns, it drains their health away like nobody's business. But if you are a higher level in this vehicle or you want to fight more infantry, which I wouldn't suggest, as these vehicles should really be used in their roles rather than have a flexible function, unless you're the tanks or one of the four-wheelers, which I'll cover later. And this here is only effective against infantry. It doesn't do much damage, if any, against vehicles. I haven't seen this used, and I've played vehicles quite a lot, and I've never seen this used. And lastly, you have the weapon pod. Here you have this shotgun-esque thing again, or you have the kinetic grenade. But when I unlock it, I would equip this anti-aircraft cannon because of the function that this vehicle has being anti-aircraft. So I would suggest to unlock all of these things as soon as possible, as it will help you win matches, assuming that your infantry does its job. Now, the two four-wheelers, the assault vehicle is the most underused vehicle in the game. This is a mobile respawn point and can help you take any objective by placing your respawn closer to it. I always see it used to provide heavy infantry support, which it's just not suited for. And it's got really low hit points, it's really easily destroyed, and it's not as maneuverable as many of the other vehicles, but it is considerably fast. If you do use this at the front line, I would only suggest to quickly drive through an objective to clear out any cover that they might have built or to run over the infantry, but then to immediately after that retreat and fall back to the location where it makes sense to deploy the respawn beacon. Now, as for the modification, you should use the thermal smoke grenade as for all the other vehicles as well, just in case someone has a lock-on missile. And the weapon station, you basically can't do anything against armored vehicles. So I would suggest to use the 40 millimeter grenade launcher, as this is the best option and the best all-rounder that you could hope for in this vehicle. but really do avoid to get this vehicle into engagements with another vehicle. Now the Tank Destroyer, this is my absolute favorite, the most underrated and arguably the most powerful vehicle in the game. It has a huge payload for being such a small vehicle. It's one of the fastest vehicles and it's very maneuverable as well. You have the choice in the driver's seat for a primary weapon between the autocannon and a howitzer. The autocannon is default option, and I would stick with this because it does enough damage against vehicles as well. Whereas the howitzer, it has a much lower fire rate and it is more effective against heavy tanks, but with the maneuverability of this vehicle, you will manage just fine with the default option of the 40mm autocannon. Then for the secondary weapon, again, I would always choose the heavy machine gun, whilst the autocannon, which has 12 shots, reloads, you use this and vice versa. You can never run out of ammunition, you can only overheat. And if you manage that well in combination with the autocannon itself, you'll be completely fine. Now, there is a glitch where when you switch from the machine gun to the autocannon, it looks as though the cooldown of your machine gun isn't taking place, but that is nonsense. If you wait, the cooldown will continue as it did beforehand. You just won't see it, and you will see the cooldown jump to 0 if you've not used the machine gun in a while. Then for the gear slots, you've got more options this time. The thermal camouflage is quite good, but it's only good against things that are far away. Most things which lock on tend to be quite close, at least in assault or attack and defend matches. Whereas in King of the Hill, where you've got helicopters, etc., this is arguably more useful than the thermal smoke grenade, but I do like using the smoke grenade more simply because it's the option that I've learned how to use the best. Whereas the smoke screen grenade, it fires a much larger smoke screen, which can also be helpful not only for you to reposition, but your allied infantry to move to a certain location. However, since no one really plays off of the vehicles and takes them to their advantage, I'll suggest to stick to the thermal camouflage or the thermal smoke grenade. Then lastly, you have the active defense or the repair kit. Again, I always choose the repair kit because the enemy can see when you've deployed the active defense. Now the passenger seat, I would suggest to use the 40mm grenade launcher because this makes it almost effective as the light tank in clearing out infantry, but in a much, much smaller package. But for the same function, you can also use the heavy machine gun quite well. If you want more damage and also a tiny bit of a better chance at fighting vehicles, the grenade launcher is the better way to go. For the second weapon station, you've got the anti-tank missile and the anti-aircraft missile. These are really good at doing exactly what they say they do, and we've covered these already, so I wouldn't go into depth for them here. But if you have a third player and you encounter a vehicle, these this position is crucial. If you only play in a duo, I would suggest that your duo switches seats every time they see a helicopter or heavily armored vehicle to be able to fight in that regard. And now, lastly, you've got the uh, grenade launcher, anti-aircraft cannon, and canister round. This seat, again, very rarely gets filled, but I would suggest to use the canister round as all other three stations combined. They deal with vehicles quickly enough, so you might as well simply choose more weapons to be able to fight infantry. Now, the quad is very self-explanatory. It cannot be customized with the exception of skins. I would never deploy this because it just drives up the price of deploying other vehicles. So if you do use this, make sure that it's one of the default spawns, because otherwise you're just complicating things for your team. And overall, it's not a good way to get around. You're really exposed, and it's also not very well suited to surviving very long. They get destroyed after one hit. Now, the again highly underused or not used properly vehicles, the helicopters. The assault helicopter is really powerful. I would say practice in maneuvering this thing first before you enter into any high stakes engagements, because the controls of the helicopters are quite tricky. Now, for the primary weapon, this is the default option. You've got the anti-personnel missile. These do damage against everything, and it always sounds like they do damage against vehicles when you use them in the matches, but here, as it says in the description, that damage is very limited. I would use it as a tool to be able to just do that extra bit of damage in case they try to repair the vehicles, but I would stick to using this against infantry. However, these rockets are also quite difficult to aim, and they don't do a lot of splash damage. Then you also have the smart rockets. They can lock onto ground vehicles within a certain range. If you use these, I would suggest for your secondary weapon, switch to air missiles, because you do not need two of the same thing effectively. So if you use these, which are really powerful, then always use it in conjunction with something else, like the air-to-air missile rather than the air-to-ground. And lastly, something that I haven't unlocked, you have the anti-vehicle rocket missile. It does really high damage against light tanks and heavy tanks or ground vehicles in general, but will no longer be viable as an option to really fight infantry, which is something that you would encounter a lot. So I would suggest that you stick to either the smart rockets or the anti-personnel missiles. Now, for your secondary weapons, you've got, as we've covered already, air-to-ground or air-to-air missile. These are both self-explanatory, but the lock-on functions only work if flares or thermal camouflage or thermal smoke grenades are not deployed. Now, as for your gear slots, you don't have any versatility. you only have a repair kit and a decoy flare. With repairing, I'd be very careful because the helicopters are glass cannons. They take 2 hits and then you're done. And it's not just vehicles you have to worry about in this case, but also against the fixed placements of anti-air cannons around the maps. So rather try to outmaneuver the enemy fire than try to stick through it and repair, especially as you won't repair fast enough to counteract all the damage that you're taking. And for your passenger seat, you have a 30mm autocannon. This does good enough damage against vehicles and can aim in a 360-degree below the helicopter. You can see it at the front there underneath the pilot seat. Now, this is also quite difficult to aim, but once you've learned how to do so, it's highly effective. I will at some point post gameplay where I'll be using all of these vehicles and showing you exactly how I tend to use them to quite good effect. Then lastly, you have the Recon Helicopter. Now this thing has 4 seats as opposed to the assault helicopter, which only has 2. 2 people sitting on the helicopter will be sat on the sides, and these I would suggest to equip with LMGs to provide high damage output and high fire rate support for your infantry, and they'll also be better able to help in fighting air-to-air targets. If you are seated in one of these places, you cannot use your gadgets. So you cannot fire your rocket launcher from this helicopter, which is a shame, but it would make this vehicle a bit too overpowered. Now you've got 2 primary weapons, which is the 20mm twin autocannon and the 7.62 machine gun. These are primarily used against other helicopters, but if you do a gun run, you should get quite low to the ground and in a straight line try to fire these weapons at highly concentrated enemy infantry, and either one of these will be a more than viable option to achieve that goal. But for the simple function of having a higher damage output, I would choose the 20mm autocannon. Then here you've got the anti-personnel rockets or the air-to-ground missiles. For this helicopter, I would suggest to keep the anti-personnel missiles because here they can be used much better against other helicopters. This helicopter is better suited to fight the assault helicopter itself than anything else, with the exception of the anti-aircraft vehicle. And you should leave the air-to-ground missiles for the vehicles like the assault helicopter, or in their function, leave this job to the ground vehicles. And then the last 2, more of the same, decoy flare and repair kits, which we won't discuss again. And you have the detector and scanner, which works the same way as it does in the ground vehicles. So there you have it. That is all of the vehicles covered. I will post gameplay on how I use most of these soon, and I hope this helped you in trying to figure out how these work, and I will hopefully see you in the next guide. See you there. Bye.